chapter 30, where he'd bring him back the Passover. But interesting to me, they couldn't get it put together quite fast enough to hit the mark. So
Yeah,
they
as
did
far
the
as all
second
the
month
priests.
instead of the first month.
Yeah.
This is very Oak Grove of them.
This is what I thought too. It's like, listen, sometimes I appreciate reading that somebody else has a hard time getting it all together too. Welcome back to Pasteurize, the podcast here going through the Old Testament. We're in Second Chronicles. You know, it gets a bad rap along with First Chronicles because it's so repetitive, right? If you've been reading, if you're keeping up with reading, then you realize, okay, I think we've read this before. And that's true. A lot of this is very repetitive from other books. But here's what I discovered. If you will actually approach it, though, each day that God has something for you in that day's reading, then you'll find something. And so we tend to find what we're looking for, right? And so if you're thinking, there's just flip a page, you've already read this before, no new information, then you're going to miss out on something unique that God wants to teach you. So this is what I've learned from Second Chronicles. I also went into it thinking, sure, wait, this feels redundant. Here we are again. But as I turned it into more of a just a me and God time, then I started seeing stuff, and he started showing me stuff and speaking to me directly, and it wasn't just a cerebral event at that point. It was a spiritual undertaking, and so I appreciated that. The Word of God, there's no bottom to it. You can keep digging in the same hole and keep finding stuff.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that we learn even as we see it. You know, they needed repetition. They certainly needed repetition because, like we mentioned before, you've got a good father, as king, and then their son turns evil. And does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And then you've got it all different ways. You've got good father with bad son. You've got bad father with good son. You've got bad leading to bad and good leading to good. Yeah. And so they needed it for sure. They needed to be reminded. And we also see that even within the law. When the king was supposed to write down the law, supposed to keep it with him and all that type of stuff, offering sacrifices. I mean, if we're talking about repetition, man, just think if we had to offer sacrifices as many times as they did. We'd be like, seriously, we got to do this again. So Second Chronicles, we're picking up after first, ending with David's reign and the temple prep. We saw a lot of that. We saw within Chronicles, we saw a lot more of what David did to prepare for the temple. And so that's where we're picking up in Second Chronicles. And one of the things that we see too is that the tabernacle is still at Gibeon, but the ark has been brought into Jerusalem. Not that this is really here or there, but one of my questions was, when God, his presence was there and he kind of sought and went to Solomon, was it at Gibeon or was it with the ark in Jerusalem? I don't know if there's really an answer to that or whether it really matters. I mean, God's presence is everywhere, but at the same time, I was wondering, I was like, so if his presence was supposed to be with the ark, was it also in the tent back in Gibeon?
God's starting to break down the walls of I'm not just in that, I'm also in this.
Yeah. I wrote down that peace promotes prosperity. And I know we think it from the perspective of Solomon, where he is the most prosperous king that's ever going to, and it says that no king will ever surpass you.
Yeah. And
so, we can, with a great deal of authority, say that he was the most prosperous king, wealthiest king that ever lived. And part of that was because there was peace. If you're having to go to war constantly, then you're using up some of your means to accomplish some of that. But it's not just from a physical aspect. I also, likewise for us, is the inner peace that comes. And with that comes the great eternal prosperity. And so there's always another layer to these things as you're reading through it and realize, okay, because they had peace, they became prosperous. And the same thing, once we have peace with God, then we get to enjoy so much prosperity spiritually.
Yeah. And we can see within physical prosperity and peace that sometimes that can lead to hardship. I think spiritual peace, that's something different. And I think that's definitely on a separate higher level.
But and I think that's basically what they sacrifice whenever things turned. They give up that relationship with God, that inner peace that they have with God that comes from following him and trusting him and obeying him. Yeah. And so that's when, the wheels start falling off.
Yeah, for sure. They start trusting other people. They aren't as courageous, so they start trusting in men, that type of idea.
I think what happens in the build-up with, David preparing for everything that Solomon's going to do kind of puts in perspective that God is in the details of every situation. So Solomon's wealth didn't just happen overnight. David had been accumulating these things and setting things in place for Solomon to be able to have this wealth. And it makes it even greater that God allowed him to keep it, because he could have said, you know what, we're done with this. You're not going to have wealth. Solomon, instead of saying, I want that wealth that, he may or may not have understood at the time when he's asking the Lord, when God comes and says, hey, I'll give you, whatever you want. he asked for wisdom instead. God could have easily said, all right, we'll give you wisdom. We're not going to have to deal with all this wealth then. But instead, God allowed him to keep it. And I just appreciated the buildup that Chronicles is giving us here. Rather than in Kings, you kind of just see it as, David dies, Solomon becomes king, and he's got all this stuff. Yeah. And so I think I see the buildup in things a lot better in Chronicles than I do in Kings.
Yeah, he's appreciate the foundation that David was building for the next generation.
Yeah, the chronicler is just way better at pointing God into the details of things, I think, overall.
Yep.
It is kind of funny just to repeat the fact that, this house that I'm going to build will be great for God. Our God is greater than all gods, there in chapter 2, verse 5 and 6. But then he also says, but who's able to build him a house since heaven and even the highest heaven cannot contain him? And so it's one of those things that's just interesting that he recognizes that this is kind of a futile undertaking, but at the same time, we're going to do it. We're going to do it big. We're going to do it elaborate so that people come and see that, yes, the God we worship is the God of all. We get the repetition of several more chapters as far as the building of the temple furnishings, and the ark being brought to the temple. And then towards the end of chapter 5, it kind of lists it saying, he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. This should be like one of those things where like, well, we've heard this before. Yeah. If we ever heard, read Psalms, then this is a big time repetition. And we just see again, in the same way that it happened with the tabernacle, now it's also happening with the temple, that the glory, the cloud filled, and the priests couldn't even do what they needed to do because of the glory of God.
Solomon's prayer, we covered that in service, 2 weeks ago? Last week?
It was last week.
Oh.
Yeah.
I know, it's been a long time.
I do want to mention there in chapter 6, though, in verse 18, but will God indeed dwell with man on earth? Because, behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. So this is kind of same thing that he said before. But at the same time, we look at this and we're like, but he will. Solomon couldn't see it necessarily. Will God's presence dwell with us? And how can it be, because nothing can contain him? And just that whole idea that we keep going back to as far as, God did make his dwelling among us in a more perfect way than even the temple in the man of Jesus Christ, but then also in his spirit that indwells his people. And so this is just crazy to think about, Solomon. I guess bottom line, it reminds me of God is able to do exceedingly more and far more abundantly than we could ever dream or imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Solomon couldn't have figured that out.
Well, I think that's a theme that we'll see throughout this entire book, is the writer is kind of leaving us wondering like what is going to happen, because no one is fulfilling the kingship the way that David did.
Right.
And so, even when he comes back from exile, it's kind of like, may the Lord dwell with the person that, follows him all the days of his life, or something similar to that. I don't have it memorized, and I'm not reading it for some reason. I could read it, but I'm not. And it kind of is like, okay, it just kind of ends there. And so like, we're just building this tension throughout the entire book. Hindsight's 20/20 for us, seeing these things. We're like, yes, this is actually good news, seeing that, Solomon doesn't understand all the things right now, but it does come to light later on.
One of the other things that I see within this prayer is often, like you mentioned, it was not an if, it was a when, and it's the humility aspect of it. And so when we turn our face and we seek God, and that's the big difference that we've been talking about a lot. If we are to take a lesson from these people, is to actually turn and seek God. And so we've seen some of the kings that will not turn and seek God even though when they're confronted. But there's that humility, and then the plea that Solomon keeps repeating is hear and forgive, hear and forgive, hear and forgive, hear and maintain, hear and maintain. God is the one who is doing the work. God is the one who is forgiving, and we are the ones who are submitting ourselves to him. And so that kind of culminates in that 7:14.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I also wrote down, just in this whole thing, chapter 7, where God is talking to Solomon in response to his prayer, that kind of reminds me of the way that God was talking through Moses to the Israelites back in the end of Deuteronomy. That's all. It's very similar.
Yeah. So we've got some more history and recording in chapter 8 and chapter 9. We've seen some of this before.
Yeah.
I did note that it seemed crazy. Solomon in verse 11 in chapter 8, he says, he brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city, and he says, my wife shall not live in the house of David, king of Israel, for the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. So he's like got this wife from Egypt, and he's like, you can't live here. You ain't holy enough. That's rough.
That's terrible. At least showed some awareness, because it's most likely that she was not worshiping Yahweh.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was reading between the lines too, as far as obviously she has not become an Israelite, if you will.
Yeah. And so Solomon dies. 70 years old, I think. Usually I write that stuff down, but I think he began reigning at 30, and he reigned for 40 years.
Yeah, he did reign for 40.
70 seems to be about the bewitching number for a lot of them.
Yeah.
Then his son became king, and that's where the wheels kind of fell off.
Yeah, and one of the things that we see in verse 15 of chapter 10, he says, King did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by God, that the Lord might fulfill his word. And so God knew what he was going to do in terms of even splitting the kingdom, what he had declared to Solomon. And so this was all according to the hand of God, that Rehoboam even listened to the younger guys as opposed to the older guys, as we saw before.
Just three generations from Saul to civil war.
Yeah.
I was like, that happened fast.
Yeah.
And now we got a split nation.
Doesn't it say that Rehoboam was like in his 40s when he began to reign? I don't remember where I read that. Someone did the math and figured out that he was like 41 or something. And so the younger officials were not, they were younger, but they weren't like 20. I always imagine like this guy is like 21 coming in here, and
young whippersnappers.
Yeah. Again, an evidence of God working through the details to bring about his will.
Yeah.
Even instigating this tragic turn of events that separated the kingdoms.
And that will be a theme throughout the rest of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've got civil war by the end of chapter 10. The house of Israel was in a rebellion against the house of David to this day. And so essentially what that's saying, if Chronicles is coming after, they're kind of in exile and then coming back,
right,
then you're looking at this and you're like, whoa, okay, so things never got better.
Right.
Yeah.
Even through exile.
Yeah.
Northern kingdoms.
I can hear Judah now. The south will rise again.
Well, and there was some effort to, was it Hezekiah that we'll see? I mean, there was some effort to try to bring them back. He's like, hey, let's send out these couriers and stuff, and let's bring everybody back. Let's worship in Jerusalem where God said, and all that.
But not by force, right? Yeah, let's invite them back to the table.
And they just laughed.
Rehoboam was going to try to do it by force, and God said, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So, after his rule, chapter 12, was established and solidified, he and all Israel rejected the law of the Lord. So, somehow I was thinking that this was Jeroboam. No, this is Solomon's son.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so this is, he had the run-in with King Shishak, and the Lord heard his prayer and, lessened the consequence of turning away.
Again, humbling themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Chapter 7, verse 14 becomes a theme throughout the whole book.
Right. In verse 12, we see it again. He humbled himself, and the Lord did not annihilate him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he ruled for 17 years, and he died.
Oh, yeah, here it is. Verse 12 or 13. He was 41 years old when he became king. That's where the math came from. His son, Abijah, now.
Ruled for 3 years, boy.
But that's just 3 months.
Yeah.
Later.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
In Kings, we get like a paragraph on him, but here in 2 Chronicles, we get this whole story that is kind of interesting. He's, basically defending David's dynasty on the hill over northern Israel and, giving it to him. You guys should be submitting to David, but you're not. And so, you're good for nothing. Meanwhile, he's given this whole speech on the hill. The northern Israel army is like kind of going around the back and is going to attack, but the Lord kind of confuses them. They blow the trumpets and God kind of fights the battle. This is where Jeroboam dies. It's just a cool story to see how the Lord's protection over David's dynasty, because logically they would have lost.
Yeah.
Again, Lord's sovereignty over these small details, a beautiful thing that we should be reminded of in our own lives.
Yeah, and they killed 500,000 of them.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, they were outnumbered 2-1.
Here's if you want a puzzle solving device, you can go back to chapter 7, verse 14. If my people who are called by name humble themselves, pray and seek my face, I'll hear, I'll forgive, I'll heal. And so what I found out is, as we track forward from that passage, each of these is a testimony of somebody either did or didn't.
Right.
And so when they did, God's promises were true. And when they didn't, God's promises were true. So we have all these examples. And so I saw basically the rest of this book is just an example of that verse played out. And so here's your example. Here's your example. And they didn't seek him, and, it went poorly, and they did seek him, and, God's grace is sufficient.
Yeah, we definitely see that all throughout the chapter. But as for us, the the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. Do not fight against the Lord. You cannot succeed because they relied on the Lord. That's how they prevailed. The Lord struck them down as far as Jeroboam, and he died.
He only had 14 wives and 22 sons and 16 daughters.
He's just getting started. Abijah dies, and we get Asa. I liked Asa.
Yeah, we talked about him in a sermon.
Yeah.
You did. I was just there.
I do be like that. He ordered Judah to seek the face of the Lord. Again, we come back to that phrase. Those, my people turned away, seek my face.
Well, I think along with that, chapter 15, it harkens back to 1 Chronicles 28:9. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you.
Yeah.
It's a repetition of it.
Yep.
And
that's right.
This is it's a dividing line, basically.
And so we see in verse 11 of 14, again, the same scenario. Asa's outnumbered, and they pray, seek God, and it works out.
Asa is unique because it gives a story of his successes and also of his failures. And so you get to see both sides. And that's just an example of humanity. Like, not everybody is going to, have these mountaintop experiences and live a beautiful life where everything they do is perfect. And this is real.
Yeah.
Where, he had good moments where he did rely on the Lord, and then he had, moments where he didn't rely on the Lord and ended up putting a prophet in jail. And so, like, that's what we're left with at the end of, chapter 16.
Well, and so a good working definition of seeking the Lord's face would be seeking his wisdom, seeking his will, right?
Yep.
And so we see here in chapter 16, Asa kind of turned away and did his own thing, leaned unto his own understanding instead of, turning to God. And, he made some treaties that were not birthed in God's will. From there, it's kind of spiraled.
Yeah. Well, and I think the sending of a prophet is the Lord being gracious to Asa and saying, hey, this is, just so you know, this is what you've done that is against me. And instead of, humbling himself and turning back, he, doesn't.
He did not take correction well.
No.
It's a real poor, actually. And so I wrote it down. How do we respond to failure or being called out? Do we shoot the messenger? Which is basically what he did, right?
Right.
Anger, pride.
Even in his disease, he didn't seek the Lord. He only sought help from physicians.
Yep.
After him comes Jehoshaphat.
Jehoshaphat. That's a fun name. He was in alliance with Ahab by marriage, which is never a good sign.
Right.
He tries to go to war with Ahab against Ramoth Gilead. This is where Ahab gets wounded and dies, and he basically goes back home.
Yeah, the story is pretty much copy and paste from Kings.
Yep.
It's too much to remember. I've got to read all.
Chapter 19, Jehoshaphat again is called out by God through the Hanani. Confront him. It's like, what business does light have with darkness, basically. Why are you hanging out with Ahab? Why are you trying to help those guys? Why is there an ally there? And so the Lord's angry with you. You've done some good things. You've removed some Asherah poles from the land, and you were determined to follow God. Yeah, he continued to live pretty decently. Jehoshaphat, pretty straight and narrow. Warned the people not to sin. Warned the rulers to judge with integrity.
Yeah, so I feel like the narratives that the chronicler puts in here are interesting because you see him kind of like with one foot in, one foot out. The marriage alliance with Ahab and then the military alliance with Ahab, but yet, he's fulfilling things that David had done by establishing, the Levites to judge. Mm-hmm. And then also, he's constantly seeking the Lord in his military conquests and campaigns. And we get a beautiful story of him trusting in the Lord and even worshiping on the battlefield. Yeah. And, that's what I feel like people remember Jehoshaphat for. But at the end of his reign here, this is a new phrase that starts to pop up. It's in verse 33 of chapter 20. However, the high places were not eliminated. The people were still not devoted to the God of their ancestors. And so the king is responsible for the people's devotion, I think is what he's trying to say here.
Yeah.
Because the king was not fully devoted, the people were not fully devoted, and it just kind of spirals down from here, worse and worse. And we get a couple of kings that have reformed, but...
Well, it's a tolerance of sin. The high places, on a number of occasions, they turn that into absolute idolatry, right? Even on the kings who it's not idolatrous, they're still worshiping God in a way that God has told them not to do. It's they're still worshiping the right God. They're just doing it in the wrong way, which again comes back to we don't get to to do what we want to. We don't get to write the rule books on these things. That God is God, and He's true, and we're all a liar, basically. But
Right.
yeah, he did not. Of course, none of them did. None of them removed the high places. It's maybe Hezekiah did some of that. We'll see. But
and Josiah.
Yeah, Josiah.
But I want to point out too, it's as far as Jehoshaphat, again, throwing back to chapter 7, verse 14. This is verse 5 of chapter 20, to the front of the Lord's temple, and he prays, and he basically prays a very similar prayer that Solomon had prayed. And when people will come to this place and they will present their distress to you, that you will hear and that you will deliver. And so that's what he's doing, in accordance to what had already been prayed, and determined by God all the way back to chapter 7. He's living in accordance to that. He's there in the midst of the people, in front of the assembly at the temple, and he's asking for God's help.
Yeah.
And God says, all right, go march down. I got this. And on the way down, God says, let's start worshiping.
Yeah.
So let's turn the thing into a worship service, guys. And so the moment they started worshiping, God started killing the enemy. And
Yeah, if people ever question, why do we sing in church? David. David instituted musicians in the temple, and we've pretty much been following that ever since.
Yeah. And so they show up to the battlefield, and all the other people were dead. And his reign ends. He was 35 years old, and he became king, and he reigned 25 years.
Jehoram is evil.
Yep. And so now we get an example of the prideful rejection.
Yeah. He's not willing to destroy God, that is. There in verse 7. Even though he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, God was not willing to destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he made with David. And that's essentially the truth that we've mentioned before. But this is why, even in the evil kings of Judah, that he's still got a remnant.
Yeah.
Somehow, some way.
But he still brought the Edomites against him. He brought the Philistines against him,
Yep.
the Arabs against him, the Cushites. They kept sweeping through and just basically ravaged the land.
And we've got the negative example of the king. So, what he said is, since he made the high places and all that, he's the one who brought Israel to sin. And that's what we see a lot too, that the king is either leading them into worship or leading them into sin.
And so not only did the kingdom suffer, but Jehoram suffered himself, died from diarrhea, and no one regretted his death.
That's hilarious. Isn't it?
No
No
tongues.
one cared.
Yeah.
Yep.
He's buried in the city of David, but not in the royal tomb.
Yeah, they didn't even put him in the same.
Like, everybody kick some dirt on him. Let's go home. Let's go eat some lunch. Yeah.
Who's next?
Yeah, basically. Like, not it.
Let's hope he's better.
Ahaziah's reign is next. I got nothing.
But his problem, his problem is that his counselors were his undoing, is what is said in verse 4 of 22.
Yeah.
But God had already decreed what was going to happen. Jehu was going to destroy the house of Ahab and all that.
Yep.
The house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule. And this is where, mommy comes in and tries to take over. And this is also where Joash, who was spoken of, I think, or no, that's Josiah. I'm getting confused. But Joash is the one who was hidden in the temple, hidden away. So again, God is working his sovereign will to keep, even though mom tried to kill everyone, Joash is still spared. Is he the youngest though? It was he 7 when he started to reign?
I think
No,
he
that
was.
Well,
7.
And Josiah was like
Josiah
8.
They're both pretty young. That's probably why you're getting them confused.
Yeah.
And Jehoiada was the priest, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And so he basically took care of hiding the king until he was at least 7.
Yeah.
Chapter 24, verse 1, Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. And he did what was right. I guess he had his ducks in a row.
But what was crazy is that, he only lasted as long as Jehoiada lasted. The way that it is written, that when Jehoiada dies, then that's when Joash kind of turns away. The council is no longer there.
Just a side note here, Jehoiada made it to 130 years old at a time everybody else was dying at 60 and 70.
Yeah.
And he was buried with the kings. Now, the king previously we spoke about was not, but Jehoiada the priest was. It's like, and all this stuff matters on some level that I haven't quite scratched into yet. But God's working these things out because there's some degree of depth to it, where you're buried and how you're buried. Because the fact that, God proclaims some omens over people that, hey, you're not going to be buried at all, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the significance is entirely, but it's more than just, we don't put a whole lot of value on it anymore. But then they certainly did, and they would have felt that. It was like, hey, the dogs are going to eat you in the street. Like, well, that's harsh, but I'm dead. What do I care, right? Well, it did matter, and in their time frame, it mattered a lot. There was something more to it that I probably just need to sit down and figure out. But and so whenever he's buried with the kings, it says something.
Yeah. Well, I think it also says something that he lived to be 130.
Oh, yeah, for
that's
sure.
what,
That's what I tell people. Hey, look, keep working for God, and there's more reasons to be here, right?
Yeah. So that's the difference between 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings. We don't get any of that Jehoiada.
Right.
It's basically like, Joash did well, and then he died because people turned on him. Well, in this, we see that it was after Jehoiada had died, Joash kind of starts slipping, and then he has a couple people that are actually named here. Zabad, son of Shimeath, and I can't even say his name. Jehozabad, son of Shimrith. And they were both foreign sons of foreign women, but turned against him.
And we see the truth, that whole, if you seek God, he will be found by you. If you forsake him, he will forsake you. And so 24:20 at the end, because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you, which is sad because, Joash, again, he started off so great.
25, Amaziah did well. Not wholehearted, but, he did some good stuff.
One of the things that's interesting about him, he seeks these other gods, even though they lost. Like normally what we're seeing, the pattern is the nations that are the victors, that those gods are the gods that are worshipped. So whether it's Israel or whether it's other, but he starts worshiping, and this comes out in verse 15 of 25. Why have you sought the gods of a people who did not deliver their own people from your hand? And so he's kind of pointing out,
right?
Is it a prophet basically?
Defeated them and brought their gods
Yeah,
back,
he's like, you're stupid.
Yeah.
Like this is completely worthless. If the other worthlessness wasn't enough.
And he rejected the correction again. Pride.
Yeah. We also see the hand of God, for it was God in order that he might give them into the hand of their enemies because because they had sought the gods of Edom. When we get to Uzziah, he's one of the better ones, right? Yeah, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. But this is also the dude that when he became prosperous, that became his downfall.
He started to believe the hype.
In some ways, he makes the same mistake as Solomon, where he goes into the temple. Solomon didn't go into the temple, but he does. And he's like, hey, I can offer this sacrifice to God. I can burn the incense before God. And the priests stand up and they're like, this is not for you, man. But the priests who are consecrated, they're the only ones.
So while they're arguing, he develops a skin disease.
Yeah.
And
grabs a censer.
Because of that, he can't enter the temple ever again.
Yeah. It's like, isn't this ironic?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we don't know how long. I don't know how long that went, but he had to live in a separate house and away from people. He was 68 years old when he died.
And he was buried near his ancestors,
yeah,
but not in the same tomb.
Again, that stuff matters. But his son apparently took over well before his death and had to run things.
So he did, Jotham, his son, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to the ways of his father Uzziah, but the people still followed corrupt practices.
Yeah, we didn't get a lot of information on him.
No.
He was determined to please the Lord. I love that.
I do like the subtle fact that he's like, he did not actually enter the temple either.
Yeah.
He did what the Lord approved. He did not,
he was a little scared.
However, have the audacity. I like that he teach.
Yeah.
He didn't have the audacity to enter the temple.
Yeah.
Fear the Lord.
That feels directed, doesn't it?
Yeah. This is a little comical note.
Yeah.
That, the writer put in here for me.
Did you hear that, Uzziah?
Yeah.
I don't want no leprosy.
All right. Ahaz, 20 years old, he began to reign. Reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what pleased the Lord.
So he's one of the ones that is one of the most evil, making images, but also burning his sons as an offering.
Yep.
And that's mentioned in a couple people.
This is where the northern kingdom actually gets the upper hand in a military campaign, which is rare. Usually the southern kingdom wins these skirmishes.
Well, I think it's probably, like, if I had to guess, this is God being a little bit kinder in how he's bringing enemies against them, because they're not a real true enemy in the sense of they're still brothers and they're a nation, but at the same time, at this point they're divided, and so he's bringing at least their own brothers against them.
Once the prophet meets them, because they're bringing back all these people that they've taken prisoners, like 200,000 people. And he says to them, listen, guys, God handed them over to you, not because you deserved them, because you did anything. You're just as guilty as they are.
Yeah.
You better let them go. That's what they did. I like the fact that they listened, You
got sins of your own that are against your God.
They released the people.
Well, this is also interesting because this is the last king of Judah before the northern kingdom ends up being captured by the Assyrians. So Hezekiah kind of like starts a new era.
Ahaz is also one of the ones that, even in his distress, does not turn to God. And so God has given him these things, but yet he dug his feet even more, and yet he was more faithless to the Lord.
Verse 24 of chapter 28, just always, it's unique when I read it, that he gathered the stuff and took it out, and then he shut the doors, erected altars on every street corner in Jerusalem. And so it wasn't just polytheistic, this was anti-Yahweh.
Yeah.
It was. It's not that we're inviting other gods because, we're unsure or we're just confused. It's like, no, this is very much how we see things today. It is more anti-Christ. That's the thing. We'll tolerate anything except the Yahweh.
Man, it's like in his digging his heels in, he's like, no, I don't want anybody to turn to that guy.
And his son was Hezekiah, which is so interesting.
Yeah, complete opposite.
The complete opposite. But his mother was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. This the Zechariah that they murdered?
There's several Zechariahs.
There's a lot of Zechariahs.
Yeah, I didn't match them up to see.
Didn't say.
That does bring up the fact that, when they mention the names of their mothers, we're not usually used to that. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, why would they often mention whose mother they belong to? The short answer, I think, at least as far as the genealogies go, they're just trying to say, well, since this guy had so many wives, they're like, that's the one that gave birth to this guy. Right. But
so the very first thing he did basically was reopen the doors to the temple.
Yeah, and fixed them all up.
Yeah.
And then got the Levites back in there and priests.
Consecrated things, purified the temple, brought out all the stuff that was unclean.
Yeah. Very Davidic in his leadership style.
Brought back spiritual sacrificial worship.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see it both at the end, around verses 20 to 22 there, and then passionate music worship starting in verse 25. And then they begin to do it Old Testament style.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, burnt the sacrifices, the peace offerings, the drink offerings, all the things.
And again, we highlight the fact that this was all willing. It started with the leadership. It was an example in the bowing, in the worshiping, in the giving, all of that. But it was willing.
Yeah. It makes me wonder how long they had gone without doing things right. Obviously, Ahaz was bad. But, you don't get a lot of, here's what was happening, as far as sacrifices and things with a lot of these other kings. Who knows how many years before they had a Passover.
Yeah.
Well, at one point when we were in the other kings, I think it was like 500 years.
Since they did one like that.
Yeah. So I was also looking because I think it was Josiah that mentioned it. And it was like, I think it said specifically that there had not been a Passover since the days of Samuel.
And so again, I went back and was reading through, and it said that again, but it said not a Passover like this since Samuel.
Yeah,
it's not that they didn't have anything, because if you go back, you'll find where there was some things, but apparently degree was what they were getting at.
Yeah, and probably in the degree, not necessarily in the amount of celebration, but according to the word.
Yeah,
according to the law.
So here it is, chapter 30, where he'd bring him back the Passover. But interesting to me, they couldn't get it put together quite fast enough to hit the mark. So
yeah,
they
as
did
far
the
as all
second
the
month
priests.
instead of the first month.
This is very Oak Grove of them.
This is what I thought too. It's like, listen, sometimes I appreciate reading that somebody else has a hard time getting it all together too. It's like, hey guys, we had a great plan. And we worked hard, but we're going to be just a little short on the time. We're going to move the schedule a little bit. How about we do it next month? Because this month just is not going to work out. And just need a little more time. People got to get consecrated. And even still, it was not.
Yeah.
it was still a little bit. People
Yeah, they
showed
didn't
up.
even have not all the people were consecrated.
Well,
even
so
with
The priests
deadline being
weren't all
moved.
consecrated.
Yeah.
The Levites were consecrated into priests, and then the people showed up and they weren't clean, and so he prayed like, God, listen, this is what we got.
Well, I think that's great because within the law, then they weren't allowed.
Yeah.
So like the provision was made that if a foreigner comes or somebody who is away comes back and they don't have time to consecrate themselves for the Passover, that they can celebrate it like a month later or
That's
whatever.
right.
And so, that's one of the things that I highlighted, that this is basically when people were coming against, this is similar to Jesus before the Pharisees, like when they were like, oh, your disciples don't wash their hands
Right,
and stuff. And he's like, listen, guys,
Yeah.
don't
Don't get too hung up on this.
Yeah, the heart
is the matter.
Yeah, and so that's what we see in verse 19, that after they pray, it says all the people who set their heart to see God, that God heard their prayer. He heard Hezekiah and he healed the people. And so God responded to the
So mine
hearts that
says
seek
forgave the people, which is a little difference, I suppose. It's I don't have the time right now to go back and word search that, but
them. As far as verse 20, healed
verse
versus
20,
forgave.
yeah, heal or forgive. Either way, God said okay.
Yeah, he responded.
And so they held the feast and unleavened bread, and it went 7 days. That's where they said, hey, let's go another 7. Yeah, 7 more days is at verse 23.
And this is the first time since the time of Solomon that there was that great of joy in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
We can't underestimate what that actually meant for them, because they're seeing what is happening with Israel. They've heard reports, I'm sure. They've seen the turmoil. They've seen all the people that have come up against them or tried to come up against them. And so, yeah, they're probably really on cloud nine at this point.
It's it gives a perception, at least, that the residents, at least a large swath of the residents, was not okay with some of the things that Hezekiah's father had done, and that they were not happy about it. And so now Hezekiah comes in as a leader that brings back true worship, and the residents are excited about this. And it's interesting to see that their government, also has that kind of authority over them, basically whether they like it or not. Here's what's happening.
So Hezekiah is doing things right. He's organizing the priests again, because again, they're, coming off of this, they're like, okay, we got to get stuff in order, if we're going to continue to offer these Passovers and these feasts and all that type of stuff. So he's getting the priests in order. But then Sennacherib, as we saw before, he comes up and he tries to invade Judah. And this is he an Assyrian? Yeah, he's an Assyrian. So this is probably very similar, because they're like, okay, well, we got Israel, now let's move on to Judah. Let's conquer the whole land.
Right.
But it's not going to happen.
Well, and so one of my takeaways on this, Hezekiah, from human perspective, is knocking it out of the park, spiritually and genuinely seeking to please God. And then he has this major opposition.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of comes back to reality. Just, because we're loving God and trusting God and following God doesn't mean we're not going to face these trials.
Yeah.
And so these challenges, and so he faces it.
And he's got to be the one that kind of has to hold the line.
Yep.
Be strong and courageous. God is with us. He's going to fight for us. And all these people are looking. And Sennacherib is obviously coming against. And he's like, listen, there's not been another people who's God who has saved them. Why do you think you're going to be any different? Yeah. And so when you're hearing that type of stuff, and even the way that it's delivered, it says that he continued to send like letters or whatever. So I'm like, this is a campaign that this guy is launching.
For sure.
And yet God still delivers. And so Hezekiah's job of trying to keep them, calm and courageous and trusting God is probably pretty difficult.
So the attack was eminently physical, but it was emotional and spiritual. He wanted to make them afraid.
Yeah.
And he wanted to tear down what they trusted in, spiritually, God. And so he did all of that. And so it's, again, a lot of application in that for our own scenarios.
Yep. But when God delivers, then he has to go back to his own land in shame, with shame of face. And then not only that, but it's not just in shame, but when he gets home, his own sons strike him down. And
so, Hezekiah played it right. Verse 24, he was stricken with a terminal illness. And again, I want to point it out because from human perspective, like, well, that don't seem fair. And that's we try to get hung up on that stuff. Like, look, God's got a plan that is bigger than our life. Live or die, it's bigger than that. And obviously he recovers, at least for the next 15 years. But at some point, we just got to recognize it's, God's plan is God's plan.
Well, it's interesting too, that because this is also where he gets proud. And so, God has done something great, but then he must think, okay, well, I mean, if we're reading between the lines and we're just kind of assuming, we're thinking, okay, well, his pride has gotten the best of him in the sense of, oh, I must be somebody special.
Right.
God has chosen me or whatever. But when, the wrath had come upon him in Jerusalem, Judah and Jerusalem, then Hezekiah did humble himself from the pride of his heart. And so the wrath of the Lord did not come upon him in the days of Hezekiah. It's just interesting just how quickly we can change something around. God does something good and we're like, oh, I must be special.
Our version says Hezekiah was ungrateful. I was like, come on, how do you be ungrateful? I was like, hey, you totally were dying and then God said, no, I'm going to let you live, and here's proof. I'm going to make the sun move backwards.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, that's pretty strong evidence. And so celebration I get, ungrateful I don't get. And so, again, it's, maybe you're right. Maybe he just figured, all right, I'm God's chosen. I'm the stuff.
Yeah.
He did this for me because of who I am. And so that's where we mess up. It wasn't because of who he was. It's because of who God was.
Yeah.
And so we got to keep our eyes on that. Not by works of righteousness that we have done, but according to his mercy.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the way, he fell in love with the stuff. Apparently, he was big into all the possessions that God had given him. And he showed it off like it was his, which is hilarious because it's not. And none of ours is ours either. So we got to keep in mind that everything we got is going to somebody else, and it belongs to God and ultimately anyway.
So when we get to his son, Manasseh, he starts off evil, but Chronicles actually lets us know that he did repent.
He did.
I don't think we get that in Kings.
No.
We have to see Chronicles to see that. And so he did what was evil. He rebuilt the high places. And so this is the pattern that we've mentioned before where they're torn down, they're rebuilt, they're torn down, they're rebuilt. And he built altars. He was also one that sacrificed his own sons as the offering. He went to fortune-telling, omen, sorcery, mediums, necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And we read that, we're like, well, yeah.
Set up a pit to conjure the underworld spirits. I mean, this guy, there was not a stone unturned in the world of just complete debauchery away from God. And so whenever he prays over in verse 13 and God responded to him, I mean, it should be, a shocker.
Yeah, it is.
But he did. He prayed. God responded with mercy, and he repented. This guy turned around.
Yeah.
And came back, which is wild. Nobody comes back hardly, right? Here he is coming back and removed the foreign gods and images. And, I mean, he went after it. And so I love this story. This is a comeback story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so for him, the downfall is that the people still sacrifice at the high places. Mm-hmm. Now, given it does say, but only to the Lord their God. Right. So it was kind of like one of those things. I guess perhaps there's some confusion still in my mind as to whether it was like, was it just that he didn't point him towards Jerusalem and to the temple or what? But anyway.
Yeah, well, Ammon, his son, becomes king, and he only lasted 2 years because he was evil as well.
Mm-hmm. Josiah, another bright spot for a minute.
So he's the one that we mentioned before as well in the prior podcast that he was prophesied in 1 Kings 13 that he would come. I mean, he was even named specifically that he would be the one that would burn the bones of the priests on their altars and cleanse Judah and Jerusalem. And so he does. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the ways of David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left, which is interesting because, again, we also see Josiah later on in life. I think he tends to decline, right? Maybe. I can't remember.
This is where it's in Josiah's days. It said it had not been observed in Israel since the days of Samuel. Passover like this, and this is chapter 35, verse 18.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is all as a result of the law actually being found. They fix the temple and they find the book of the law.
It's had revival.
Yeah. So it brought revival.
They read it. And
he died at 39 years old, which, is early by any standard, right? He perished because he was in a fight they didn't have any business being in.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. I read this. It's like, this was not his fight.
Yeah.
He could have just stayed in Judah. And instead, he went out to face Necho. And Necho even told him, like, hey, God's already told me this is what's happening, that you shouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And so he got killed.
And Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, which all the male and female singers used to mourn Josiah to this very day.
He was
probably because they're thinking the same thing we are. We're like, dude, what in the world?
Yeah, it was sad. Now, he was a loved king and did a lot of good stuff and then died early. So I'm sure it was a
tragedy.
A blow to the kingdom.
Yeah. it was good for us to have a little bit more on Josiah, because when we get to the rest of them, it's like, okay, 3 months, then 11 years, 3 months, then 11 years for these last 4.
Yeah.
And and they were just all evil.
Yep. And this is all, little by little, the pieces are falling apart. Egypt first, but then Babylon's right behind them, and then Babylon again. And they try to resist, but Babylon again.
I think verse 15 is where we see, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Mm-hmm. And so God, obviously in his foreknowledge and everything, he already knew what was going to happen. He even prophesied it. But at the same time, we can understand that there's no remedy, because now, especially them coming back from exile, at least in their contemporary, when they're getting this letter, so to speak, that, okay, well, we're waiting for somebody better. We're waiting on that promised Messiah.
Yeah. So the land's going to experience its sabbatical years, which they did not ever do, apparently. And, of course,
and God told them that too, right? That was in the law.
That's it. And this book ends uniquely with the spotlight on King Cyrus of Persia, which God is actually using it. And so this guy is proclaiming good stuff about the Lord, and his heart seems to be with God. And so he finds a softness, and he begins the rebuild of Jerusalem. But that's kind of, now that we've told you that, we're going to backtrack
right
here through the ways and give you some more details on that through Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. So we're going to go back a minute for sure. It's this is almost the end of the story. This is they're coming back from the deportation, which took 70 years.
Yeah.
And so prior to that, we're going to have some prophets, and even during that, we're going to have some prophets. Basically, the rest of the Old Testament is going to conclude back to this point.
Yeah. There's about to be that 400 years of silence, essentially, depending on how you put the timing of everything. So it's kind of left on a cliffhanger, but we'll pick up in Ezra.